right now, and we are blessed to have with us Dr. Helen Frisby of the Folklore Society, who is going to reveal all about the rituals of death and dying in the medieval period. Thank you, Helen.
Well, thank you very much, Stu, for that very generous introduction, to which I very much hope to live up tonight. It's lovely, really, really lovely to be here with you all tonight, talking about medieval funeral customs, and we will be spanning the sort of full range of the so-called Middle Ages, from around 500 AD through to the Reformation, and perhaps just even slightly beyond. So, I should say, before I sort of start, I will have a couple of slides, as you might expect, with a talk of this nature, which show human remains. I will also be briefly mentioning stillbirth and suicide, but all of those things very much in context of how people in the Middle Ages built and maintained relationships with their dead, which will be the main thread linking all of those years from around 5 to 1500 AD. So this is the bit now where I very, very smoothly, of course, take us to the slideshow, which I hope will come through to you all in just a moment. It might take a moment with a number of people in the room, but Stuart, hopefully you can give me a thumbs up
It
to
is
let me know.
it looks terrific already,
Wonderful.
Helen.
Okay, so we'll actually start in the 21st century with what I think is a fairly typical sort of present day funeral scene, which in both the look and the content is very much about marking the tastes and the interests and the personality of an individual who's died. In many ways, this is a very 21st century funeral scene. But what if we were to time travel back into the Middle Ages? Well, I think it's fair to say that there is still very much that we would recognise as being a funeral. That said, there is one detail on this scene which perhaps might look a little odd to our eyes, and that if we look underneath the coffin, we'll see the two small chaps there carrying something in their hands, and what they're carrying are handbells. And these handbells, on one level, were a very practical thing. They were about letting people know that a funeral procession was coming, so you'd better get out the way. And in many ways, funerals are very practical things, aren't they? They're about getting a large, heavy, and sometimes not very pleasant object from A to B, possibly via C, D, and E, with a certain amount of ritual and ceremony. But they're also very much about getting the dead where they need to go, and they're very much about getting the bereaved where they need to be. And that was as true in the Middle Ages as it is nowadays, because these bells were also a means of scaring away any evil spirits which might be lurking and trying to interfere with the soul's passage into the afterlife. And this is our first clue into a few differences with how people in the Middle Ages might have experienced death and dying. I said so-called Middle Ages earlier, and it's probably a good idea at this point, before we go any further, to just look at a little bit of terminology, because actually the term middle time, middle antiquity, middle era, middle times, these are all terms which first appear in the 16th century. The time media tempestas, middle time, was actually first used by Giovanni Andrea, the Bishop of Aleria. And these are all slightly later terms. People in what we think of as the Middle Ages would not have thought of themselves as being the Middle Ages or being medieval, because this is a later label. It's first on the Middle Ages, there we are. as well. The first occurrence in English by the jurist and legal historian John Selden didn't appear until as late as 1618. This was the early modern period's way of looking back and sort of trying to create the idea that in between the glories of classical civilization, the Romans and the Greeks, and their present day in the 16th and 17th century was this sort of lull, this slightly dead and quiet and cold period where not a lot happened culturally or socially or any other way. And so it's often used in quite a negative or a pejorative way to contrast between the glories of classical antiquity and those new glories of the Renaissance, another very morally loaded word. Tonight, hopefully, I'm going to persuade you that the Middle Ages, the medieval period, was actually a time of great creativity, not least in acknowledging and coping with the realities of human mortality. I'm still going to use the terms medieval and Middle Ages because we haven't quite worked out a suitable and quick way of summarising everything I've just said, but we'll use them in mental inverted commas, just remembering that people in the Middle Ages would not actually have thought of themselves as being the Middle Ages. So let's go back then right to the post-Roman period, a time often also sometimes I think very unfairly known as the Dark Ages. It's only really dark because not a lot of sources, or not a lot of the kind of sources that historians like to work with, i.e. documents, tend to survive from this period. We just get little clues and scraps here and there, but what we do get, of course, is archaeological evidence. Now, this is a time when the idea of England itself was still coming into shape. It was still emerging from its constituent countries, and between about 500 and about 750 AD, along with that, we see the arrival and spread of Christianity. In different ways, in different places, and at different speeds. So when we're talking about this sort of earlier part of the medieval period, we just have to bear in mind that actually religion, and with that funerals and death, were there was a great deal of variety. It's very difficult to talk of an English way of death, or even sometimes England, at this period. So we really do need to emphasise regional variations here. Now, the best and most spectacular instance of a burial from this period is, of course, that at Sutton Hoo, illustrated at the top. Sutton Hoo is near Woodbridge in East Anglia. It's certainly elite, possibly even a royal burial, and it contained extensive grave goods when it was dug out in the 1930s. Which were intended to demonstrate whoever the occupant was. It was intended to show off they and their families' wealth, power, taste, and as well as to help them along with all the things that they might need in the afterlife. So we're seeing a mixing up there of Christianity with local religious customs and belief as well, and that's very much how Christianity spread in the British Isles at this time. It was very much about incorporating and hoovering up what it found. And the burial on the left, which is from slightly further south, we see, but still in the east of the country, we see the same principle of taking the stuff that you'll need into the afterlife with you. This is a male burial, which we know not just from the osteology, but also from the fact it was buried with a shield. So we can just see the boss of the shield there on top of that left arm, and slightly to the right of the skull, we can see a small dagger as well. So this was almost certainly a male burial. Female graves tended at this time to use jewellery to denote role and social status. On the right, we have, it's actually a line drawing of a fairly typical, again, this is an elite because they tend to leave the most evidence at this period, tombstone cover, and we can see there the increasing Christian influence with the cross and the keys of St. Peter, the keys to heaven, of course, at the top. And then in the middle, on the bottom, we've got some examples of hogbacks. These are very typically found in northern England and Scotland, and they very much speak to the kind of the Scandinavian influence in that part of what at the time was becoming England. We don't really know a whole lot about them. It's one of the most popular theories is that these were some kind of houses for the souls of the dead people whose grave they marked. But they remain tantalisingly mysterious, and I think part of the fascination of funeral customs at this period is the mystery. I mentioned that there's not a lot of surviving evidence for this sort of pre 10th century period, but you know we do have little scraps here and there. We know, for example, it was important to prepare a body after someone who died, to wash it, to dress it, to lay it out. We know that the deathbed was really important. It was important to make your confession, ideally to a priest, and to be anointed. We know that as well as being washed and dressed and laid out, that bodies would be wound or wrapped in a sheet, and in fact a millennium later winding sheets would be the subject of the country's first ever funeral legislation, the Burial in Wool Act. So a nice thread continuing there throughout our period, quite literally. And we know that it was increasingly customary at this time for the soul to be cared for. So they've got the body being cared for, but also there's this sense that the dead are named individuals, and that they are individuals they remain capable of receiving help from the living after they've died. And certainly from the 8th century, we see this emerging practices of saying special masses for the souls of the dead, as well as a way of focusing and channeling that kind of ongoing relationship between the dead and the living. And we know this sort of stuff from that there aren't any sort of surviving actual liturgies from this period, but we do see odd scraps in, for example, penitentiaries from the period, and also a really good source, and this is a theme we'll see throughout the talk, is clergy complaining, whether it's parish priests complaining to their superiors about the sort of the practices that they're finding and trying to manage and sometimes to get rid of, or indeed whether it's bishops complaining to their superiors in Rome and asking for more resources to help, as they sort of Christianise the population. So clergy complaints are always a really big way of finding out not just what's going on in church, but what people are actually doing in their homes as well. From the 10th century, and particularly again in the east of what was now England, we start to see the emergence of the parish system, and for the sort of kind of religious and community life to be very much focused on those parish church buildings. And with it, comes the idea of burying the dead in the ground around the church. And I'm often asked, well, you know, did the churches or the burial grounds come first? Interesting question. We're not quite sure is the answer. Exhibit number one in this argument is often the yew trees, which are often and perhaps otherwise inexplicably tend to be found still in the grounds of very old parish churches. And this could really, really go either way, because our oldest parish churches, as I've just indicated, are about 1,000 years old. And our oldest yew trees are about 1,000 years old. So who knows? Again, it's one of those mysteries. There was also, we know that at this time from sources like, for example, Wolfson of York, who made a list of people who were deemed unworthy of being included in this community of the dead and the living. People who'd worshipped other gods, or nature, who'd taken part in witchcraft, probably quite broadly defined, who committed murder, adultery, oath breaking, lying. So I suspect many of us, by Woolston's rather strict standards, probably would have been excluded. But so clearly parish clergy, sort of on the ground, as it were a little more pragmatic and flexible. And again, that's a theme that we kind of see coming through all along. We also, of course, start to learn again a little bit more about both religious and secular funeral rituals at this stage. The use of candles, incense, oil, and holy water, and the custom of what's called smudging the body with ashes, which probably was a sign of penitence. We know that it was customary to bless a haircloth on which the body would then be laid out. And this is where we first learn about the custom of waking in its older sense, not of, as we know it nowadays, of a meal taken after the funeral, but as a vigil held between the death and the funeral. And again, the reason we know this is through an instruction to clergy not to participate in the eating and drinking and general merriment that went on at these occasions. So, if we think about Victorian funeral reform campaigners complaining about this, you often think that not a lot really changes. So, by the turn of the first millennium, there is a clear sense then that there's this ongoing relationship between the living and the dead, in which the dead have a claim upon the physical and spiritual care of the living. And there's a bit of a shift taking place in sort of Christian, what we call eschatology. That's a sort of area of Christian theology to do with judgment and the last things, because up until then there'd kind of been this sense that the church didn't need to worry too much about fleshing out the details of the afterlife, because the judgment was kind of imminent anyway. But it was beginning to become rather evident that actually we were sort of settling in for the long term. So we sort of better think a bit more about exactly what happens in regard to these last things. And the answer is very nicely illustrated, and Stu, you're absolutely right that we have got at least one doom painting tonight. This is from St Thomas's, Salisbury, which is next door to the cathedral. I always feel that the churches next door to cathedrals are very much neglected, and this is certainly a hidden gem here. And what sort of seems to have merged this idea is that somewhere between the end of this life and the beginning of the rest of existence is this almost like a heavenly waiting room, if you like, where people go after they die to await the end of the world and their final destiny. So then, of course, the next question is, what was this waiting room like? Well, if we read from left to right across this fairly typical sort of example of a doom painting, we can get the general outlines. So on the left here, we've got the dead arising from their slumber. You'll see that they're all, except the priest, facing east to west, or neatly lined up and ready to go. And you'll see the angels there blowing trumpets to wake them up, and then escorting them to where Christ sits in judgment at the top. Just to the left of Christ, we can see Mary there, sat with her arms outstretched, dressed in blue. And above Mary, we can see all the saints. We know they're saints because they've got halos. And then under Christ's feet, of course, we have the disciples. And we can see on the right what happens to those who are judged to be lacking. Off they are taken to a really quite ferocious and scary looking hellmouth there, intended to inculcate fear and a desire to set yourself back on the moral path to all who looked at it. And as I say, these are this is a fairly typical example of the sort of thing. But what happened to the people who were neither clearly good enough to go straight to join Christ in heaven, nor to be dispatched to hell and whatever grisly fate awaited them there? Because most people, you know, as we sort of touched on just now, are neither perfectly good nor perfectly bad, are they? And what the church comes up with is this place called purgatory, a place of purgation or cleansing, where you go in between death and the final judgment to be cleansed of your venial or your worldly sins. There are a few sins which are not forgivable, but most sins, you know, because again, people are pretty pragmatic when it comes down to it, are redeemable in some way. And the 1274 Council of Lyon defined this place as being where their souls are cleansed after death by purgatorial or purifying punishments. And this is the interesting bit, to relieve punishments of this kind, the offerings of the living faithful are of advantage to these, namely the sacrifice of masses, prayers, alms, and other duties of piety, which have customarily, so this is church doctrine catching up with what's actually been going on for a while, being performed by the faithful for the other faithful according to the regulations of the church. So clearly this is just sort of mopping up and codifying what's actually been going on for a while. And again, this is this sort of human logic, isn't it? That however people always want to know what's the next step. So we've had you know, what happens to the dead in between the end of earthly time when they die in the last judgment. They go to a waiting room. What's that waiting room like? What happens there? And what can we do to help? So purgatory is a very useful place because it offers the dead the prospect of eventual salvation, and it also offers the bereaved something to do. It offers them some hope and some comfort, a sense of agency and even perhaps control in a situation where, let's be honest, you don't feel that you've got very much control. Now, one of the best known sort of creative developments, because of course this then spawns a whole other artistic tradition. So one of the most creative developments of purgatory is probably that of Dante's Divine Comedy. And here's the famous 15th century, 15th century illustration of that, where we see Dante there, and if we look at the bottom left, we've got to see the excommunicate there, who very appropriately are sat on the outside trying to get in. And then we've got the late repentant, so the people who've repented but left it a little bit too late. We'll come back to that in a moment, about that sort of pressure on the medieval deathbed to get yourself in before it's too late. And then working upwards, we've got the proud, we've got the envious, the wrathful, the slothful, the covetous, the gluttonous, and the lustful. So all those sort of venial sins that, you know, with a bit of okay, not very pleasant, but time limited work. That's the key thing in for most medieval theologians, including Thomas Aquinas. Purgatory is qualitatively as uncomfortable as hell, but the key thing is that there is a prospect of an end to it. That's what matters. And it's representations like this that really help cement purgatory as a sort of the idea of a very physical kind of place that was just beyond the veil of this life. And what was that life like? Well, by our standards, it was typically short. Oh, sorry, we've got a close up there so you can see the sinners being cleansed appropriately for whatever they've done. So yeah, that life was typically short by our standards. It often ended abruptly, whether through infectious disease or accident. But even by those medieval standards, the mortality brought about by the plague of 1348 to 9 was a shock. Now, the plague seems to have first arrived in England in June 1348, and estimates vary. We'll never really know how many people died, but the latest calculation is that it went on to kill somewhere between 40 to 60% of the entire population. It's interesting, though, even at the very height of this crisis, care was still taken to look after the dead as much as possible. We talked earlier about the dead neatly lined up, waiting east-west, waiting to face Judgment Day, with their priest facing them, waiting to minister to them once again. In recent years, quite a lot of Black Death era mass burial pits have been excavated, particularly around London, as a result of the HS2 construction works. And what that has shown us is that even at the height of this absolute crisis of mortality, that again, people were lined up neatly. They were, as far as we can tell, they were organised. They were, as far as we can tell, neatly wrapped up, wound in their winding sheets. People took care and trouble with the dead, even at the absolute worst of the plague. Now, some historians think that tropes like the dance of death or the danse macabre were a traumatised population's attempt to make some sense of what was going on. Here we see people from all sorts of life, including a monk there on the right. It's both the poor and the wealthy. Nobody escapes. That alternate with skeletons and this ever whirling, non-stopping, quite wild and surreal, and yes, macabre dance of life and death there. And the very clear message from this is that death comes for everyone, no matter who you are, so be prepared. And yes, it was important to be prepared for death, and medieval people knew what to look out for, probably a lot more than we do nowadays. I'm going to read out this this memento mori, or remember death, verse, which is from slightly later, from the early 15th century. It's from Robert Raines's commonplace book. When mine eyen misten, and mine earen sissen, and my nose coldeth, and my tongue foldeth, and my rood slacketh, and mine lips blacketh, and my mouth grenneth, and my spottle renneth, and my hair riseth, and mine heart griseth, and mine honden bivian, and mine fet strivian. All too late, when the beer is at the gate. So people were very familiar with what a dying person looked like and felt like, and probably smelled like as well. And again, they go with that whole kind of visual culture that we've been looking at with the doom windows and so on. So what could you do in the face of this? Well, again, people are incredibly good at finding ways to take control of the uncontrollable. And we certainly find that in nature, a whole series of omens and portents. The owl eke that of death the bode bringeth. That one goes back to the 12th century. It was also attested by Chaucer in the 14th century, and it was still being attested in the 1930s by folklorists collecting in rural Lincolnshire. So that was a very, very long-lived folk belief there. A dog howling by a house that portended death. The number of cuckoo cries that denoted the number of years that you had left to live. Another one that's still being attested well into the 19th century. And certain days, it's always Eves, New Year's Eve, St John's Eve, St Mark's Eve, which were considered especially good for divinatory rituals, which were supposed to give you clues about who was destined to die, or when you were destined to die, or even how you were meant to go. So again, it's people trying to exercise some kind of agency here. Now, this period also sees a sort of rise of what's called the ars moriendi, the How to Die, the Art of Dying literature. And again, this is something that continues well into the early modern period, and some of the themes are still very recognisable today. There's a great stress in the medieval period on a good deathbed. This was a sort of the make or break moment when you could either find your way into heaven or be, or like the chap on the right, make a mess of it and have the demons rear up to bear you off to wherever you were going. It was important, of course, to have your worldly affairs in order, and most medieval wills were made upon one's deathbed, often dictated to, say, the priest in attendance, who would be the person who could write that down. There was also the bequeathal of your soul to God, and how people do that and the kind of formulae they use and can be sort of quite interesting to track through the Reformation, but we'll come back to that later on. It was important particularly to appeal to your name saint for help at this most critical of moments. And in the deathbed scene on the left, we can see there the saints gathering around the deathbed. We can see the angels waiting to bear the soul up to heaven. Nowadays, of course, people often say that the dead become angels. There's been that sort of subtle shift there. And then above the person's head, just at the top of the bed head, you might be able to see a small winged figure, which is the soul waiting to ascend its way up. So ideally a dying person was able, although sometimes in practice had to be a bit pragmatic and perhaps assume that they did, demonstrated an understanding of the key items of Christian faith. They were able to confess their sins and thus received absolution. So the priest really was a key person at the medieval deathbed. The only exception to this was, provision for midwives to perform an emergency baptism if no priest was readily available and a child had been either stillborn or looked likely to die quickly. In practice, what records we have suggest that, what sort of level of care people can expect to receive. Priests varied in their level of competence and care, but also that they would often make quite pragmatic and humane decisions if somebody were incapable of communicating. In terms then of sort of what happened after somebody had died, well, of course then with the development, as we said earlier, of the parish system, there was then a journey, sometimes quite a long journey, from the place of death to the parish church and the parish burial ground. And this was an opportunity for some processional customs because, as we indicated earlier, on the one level, it's a very pragmatic thing about getting an object from A to B, but it's also an opportunity to kind of walk that journey, that sort of spiritual journey into the afterlife. It's an opportunity perhaps to prevent the soul coming back and make sure it does actually get where it needs to go. And it's of course also an opportunity because people are human, and it's an opportunity as well to perhaps sort of assert your kind of your social and economic status as well. And funerals continue, of course, to fulfill all those functions nowadays. Most ordinary people certainly would have been carried along the way in the parish coffin. This is a early 17th century example which survives in Easingwold in North Yorkshire, East Yorkshire. A little bit further north and west, we also have an image here of the Corpse Road, which you can still walk in from Keld to Grinton in Swaledale. And as you can see, it's even nowadays, it's still quite sort of rough and rocky country. So imagine carrying one of those parish coffins like the one illustrated on the left across this terrain, perhaps for several days, in some of the wild and woolly weather that we get up there. Often these corpse roads would twist and turn in order to confuse the spirit and prevent it returning home. And you should beware if you saw jack-o'-lanterns or corpse lights along the way, another folk belief which persisted well into Victorian times. And as we noted earlier, bells were rung. These performed that very practical function of saying that the procession was coming, but also repelled any evil spirits which might be hovering around. And in fact, in rural areas like the one illustrated here, the very sort of practical difficulty of transporting the dead was often, we see people trying to make the case for having a chapel of ease more locally. And that was often a big part of the case to do that. We think that people often would sing along the way. They would sing often quite sort of wild folk dirges, nothing like the sedate funeral hymns that were written from the 1840s onwards. Songs like the Lyke Wake Dirge, which was first recorded by John Aubrey in the 1680s, but probably much older, which records not just the body's physical journey to be buried, but the kind of the spiritual journey, the soul over Winnie Moor. Win meaning is a northern word meaning thorn. So the thorny moor to reach purgatory, where they are tested in life according to, or helped according to how they've helped others in life. In towns, meanwhile, trade guilds were developing and growing, and they would help swell the number of mourners and therefore the prayers for the departing soul at the funerals of their members. So urban medieval funeral processions could be quite elaborate affairs. And again, as we said, lots of this sort of social and economic aspects of asserting status there. So on arrival at the church, the coffin would be taken through the lich or the corpse gate into that sort of sacred space, and it would be placed in the church. The exact location it would be placed in depended on your social status. So the more the wealthier and higher status you were, the nearer you would be to the altar. Lich gates, as we find them now, are often have often been restored more or less well, depending on your taste, by the Victorians. So what you see nowadays is not necessarily always what people in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century saw. The exact form of funeral service varied by region and season. There was no one funeral liturgy at the time. There were various usages depending on which bit of the country you were in. But typically there would be some sort of matins for the dead that would be said on the morning of the funeral. There'd be some sort of requiem mass, and then the priest, wearing either black or occasionally blue was also a mourning colour, vestments, would lead the company to the graveside, where the priest would mark the spot with a cross. Now, unlike today, we have a burial today, the graves all dug and prepared beforehand. In medieval times, it was actually dug at this point while the funeral party waited, and we see that happening here on the bottom right to this image. We see the gravedigger at work. So medieval graves were a lot shallower than they are nowadays. The grave was blessed, it was aspersed and censed, and the body was placed in that east-facing direction, and then there were more prayers while the grave was closed, again while people watched. The north side of the churchyard was typically avoided. That was often used for strangers to the parish, for stillborn babies, and sometimes for those who had died by suicide, again depending on how liberal and pragmatic the particular priest happened to be. So the north side was generally the less favoured of the areas of the churchyard. The typically the south, the east side and west side for obvious theological reasons, and also the south side because that's often where the church entrance is. So the grave will then be seen and remembered and prayed for as people go to and from church day by day. We might also want to note the, certainly to our eyes, rather chaotic and messy nature of this particular medieval burial scene with the bones turned up, speaking to perhaps a very different sensibilities about bodies. Also note the gravedigger's tools. A few years ago, a colleague and I were doing some research with some modern day gravediggers, and we asked them about the tools they use for hand digs, many of which are remarkably similar to those of their medieval forebears. We might also note the wooden memorial at the back of this scene there. These were most usual for most ordinary people, and it's quite rare, understandably, for these to survive. That is why the oldest gravestones that you will typically see are from the 17th century onward, because that is when individual burial in perpetuity started to become the normal thing. In the Middle Ages, it was actually normal for, as we'll see in a minute, for bodies to be left in the ground for somewhere between 10 and 20 years, depending on the soil type, until until the flesh had all decomposed, and then, as we'll see in a moment, they would have been placed in a charnel house. In fact, I think we'll go on to that image now. We used to think that these were occasional oddities. There are a few dotted around the country. Recently, archaeologists have begun turning up more and more of these ossuaries. So we think that what happened was at the Reformation, these were mothballed because they were closed down because because the idea was that reformers were worried about them becoming sort of the focus of, as they saw it, superstitious prayers for the dead. But in the sort of to and fro with Reformation at the time, people weren't sure, so they just mothballed. They literally just shut the doors and walked away, and over time they were then just gently forgotten about, and they sometimes get rediscovered by archaeologists today. So anyway, after your typical medieval funeral services, then as now, there would have been food and drink provided. It's very common for medieval wills to bequeath more money for that than for the survivors to inherit. That's probably a very different set of priorities from today. But again, it's all about those all-important prayers for the dead and soliciting them through gifts, not actually just of food, but also of clothing as well. And again, we see these doles, or at least the residue of the custom, going on in some cases well into the 19th century. And then there's a system of post-mortem mines as well. So typically a month, a year after the death, and then annually the dead person would be remembered and again prayed for. And then, of course, there was sort of the communal seasonal festivals of the dead, All Souls on the 2nd of November, and of course ghost beliefs as well, which could be a talk in themselves. In the medieval period, ghosts are very much about the dead coming back to finish unfinished business. It's only with the Reformation that we see them increasingly being framed as sort of demonic messengers. So if you were a little bit wealthier and you could afford some sort of permanent memorial, it might well have been something like this, from St Michael's Spurrier Gate in York. And William Hancock and his wife Ellen, by the fact of having this permanent memorial, we can tell that they probably were fairly well off. And it begins with that orate pro anima, or actually pro omnibus here, because it's for the two of them, formula, that pray for the soul of. So it's a direct call out to anyone who's passing to, remember me, pray for me, help me now I can no longer help myself. It's very much that continued live bond between the living and the dead. If you were a bit wealthier, of course, you could and you really wanted to make an impact, you could have one of these, a transitu, which depicts the living person on the top, and rather graphic to our sensibilities, representation of them as a decaying skeleton, often complete with rats and worms and all sorts of lovely things on the bottom there. And if you really wanted to go to town and had the money, you could, of course, have your own chantry chapel and engage your own priests to say masses in perpetuity for your soul and those perhaps of your family as well. The blue paint on the top of this chantry chapel is a Victorian restoration. Again, the Victorians doing their thing there, but the red paint, which you might just be able to see through the barred gate, is original. Now, interestingly, this one, the inside, does have the orate pro amina formula, but it's in English. Let's pray for the soul of. So again, maybe we can see a shift there as we get towards the very end of this Middle Ages period, she says, with inverted commas firmly around them. Because you might notice the date here on this one. It was built right on the eve of the Reformation, and was never actually used as a chantry chapel as Thomas West intended. And I think one of the reasons that this has survived in such wonderful shape is because it's in what is in even nowadays a very rural and difficult to get to corner of rural Sussex. And this really sort of brings us into the Reformation now, because the Reformation was very much a reaction against this sort of this close-knit bond between the living and the dead. The dead are at the very much the heart of the Reformation, and this is an example of something called an indulgence. It's a document which you could buy from the church, which would remit all the sins of your dead loved one. And naturally, of course, it cost a lot of money. And Martin Luther's Protestantism was really a protest. Again, this very monetary sort of economy of salvation, if you like. And whether or not now the Reformation in England, of course, took a very particular course, and again, that could be a whole talk in itself. But it was the short version is that it was very much in the dynastic and political and financial interests of Henry VIII to, shall we say, reject the authority of the Roman Church. Although Henry himself, interestingly enough, did have seems to have had a Catholic deathbed mass for himself. His son Edward, of course, was more of a conviction Protestant. Mary, then we had the sort of Catholic Counter-Reformation for years, and finally we had the Elizabethan settlement. So that's sort of to and fro for quite a number of years in this country, between the extremes of Protestantism and Catholicism, until we settled on the current Church of England, which attempts to be a compromise to please at least some people some of the time. So that's the very, very short version of the English Reformation there. And part of the sort of, I think, for that reason of to and froing is that in this country, it does seem, when you sort of get away from the kind of top-down level of church doctrine and royal proclamations, we see a very much more mixed and complicated picture of people who did and did not take the Reformation to their hearts. And I think I think this is beautifully put by the folklorist and historian Theo Brown, writing in, I think it was 1978, who wrote about that when you sort of stripped the funerary, when you stripped funerals of the comforts of the mass and the intercessions and the prayers and the sense that there were things that you can and should do for the dead, what is left is really a very stark, a very harsh and unremitting and unrelented, very little really. There's nothing you can do except give the dead up to God and hope, and that doesn't sort of always sit well with that human need, does it, to do something about the situation. So what we seem to end up with in this country is a sort of a bit of an interesting situation where some of those previously loved funeral customs, like the funeral mass, end up being transposed into the domestic sphere of what came to be known as folklore. And one particular custom, which I'm often asked about, of course, is that of sin eating. And what we can see here, this is actually an early 19th century illustration of the custom, where we have the lady of the house handing over the either the biscuits or the cakes, accounts vary, to the sin eater. who kneels there to receive them, and in so doing to sort of almost kind of magically receive and imbibe the sins of the dead person, so that the dead person can then go on into the afterlife unencumbered. And after they've taken the cakes, and you might notice a little boy at the bottom there who's trying to, clearly doesn't realise what was going on, and trying to get at the cakes there. I think that's such a sweet detail. He'll take the wine as well, that's illustrated in the foreground. So, you know, bread, wine, it's all very communion like, isn't it? And it certainly feels like it, you know, it ought to be a really old custom. But actually the first custom we get of it, and again, surprisingly, it's a complaining clergyman. It's Mr. Gwyn of Pembrokeshire. I haven't been able to find Mr. Gwyn in the records, I have to say, but he's there in Brand's Antiquities. And it's actually a very short, very pithy statement about this custom which has been difficult to excise. So he's complaining to his superior that there's this rather to him pagan feeling folk custom going on that he can't quite persuade people to drop. And we have to wait until the 1680s and John Aubrey for a more detailed account of the custom. Also, a little bit later on, we have William Lelland's account and Thomas Bagshaw. Nowadays, the custom is very much associated with Wales and the Marches, but actually we have accounts of this custom going on all over the British Isles, and indeed well into the 19th century. You have to be a bit more careful when you get into the Victorian period, because Victorian antiquarians used to love to take those earlier accounts by Lelland and Bagford and Aubrey and so on, and recycle them. So you have to be a little bit careful, but it does seem that in some places the custom does still trickle on down into the 19th century, and indeed it's 1906 that the last Sin Eater is finally laid to rest at St Margaret's in Ratlinghope in Shropshire. So we will circle back round there to our modern day funeral. Quite different, but also, as I've suggested, quite similar in the way that people, you know, we have this need to have continuing bonds with the dead on a very human kind of level, and how creative people are with ritual to do that. So I will leave that there, and I will stop the slide share